The Venerable Bede is one of the iconic English figures in history, and was widely considered among the most educated men in Europe during the early medieval period. The man was an absolute genius and a total master of the Latin language, which was a pretty good metric for how well educated someone was at that time. But how did he learn Latin? How did he teach his students Latin? Luckily, I was able to take a time machine back to his monastery in Wearmouth Jarrow in 720 AD and record one of his lessons. Take a look here. Vocales appellantur. A, E, I, O, U. Nu sag jathat eft. A, E, I, O, U. Thasaron in Latin, vocales iceictu. Unfortunately, that's all I was able to get before I was transported back to the modern era. But using different sources ranging from subtle inferences to block quotations to actual lists of books, we have a pretty good idea of what kind of materials and lesson plans Bede used to not only learn Latin but teach his students, from the first letters to advanced poetry. In today's video, I'll be walking through these materials, talking about their significance, how they were used in the classroom, and how we can mimic their education. Stay tuned. Number 1. Letters and Grammar. For monks in Bede's time, Latin learning and literacy went hand in hand. If you didn't know Latin, you probably also didn't know how to read. That said, reading and copying texts was one of the most useful ways that monks could get early exposure to the language, so it had to be one of the first things taught. Bede himself wrote an explanation of the alphabet in one of his educational treatises, De Arte Metrica, the Art of Poetic Meter, which begins with preliminary grammatical instruction. What is a letter? What is a vowel? What is a syllable? These were some of the first things taught to young students and were likely hammered in with long lectures and repetition exercises. So you should picture Bede standing at the front of the classroom reciting things like Sunt autem Latina littera omnes fiinti et una. That is, there are 21 Latin letters, and presumably you and your fellow students would commit things like this to memory. The teacher might go around the room and ask questions like, how many Latin letters are there? What are the grammatical cases? What is a verb? And hopefully you would answer correctly. If not, there might be consequences. Bede was extremely interested in the grammatical arts, and we know that he had at least 20 different Latin grammars in his library. The most famous of these was the Ars Maior of Aelius Donatus, which Bede probably had on hand when teaching his beginner students, if he didn't just actually have the entire thing in his head. He certainly quotes from it frequently enough that I wouldn't be surprised if he had memorized large sections of it, and even though he sometimes complains about decisions that Donatus made, he clearly considered it the best grammar out there. If you were one of Bede's Latin students, this work would certainly be a part of your early education. Along with another grammar he was fond of, the Institutiones Grammaticae of Priscian. This book has long lists of vocabulary and explains each word's proper declension and conjugation. Bede, as a young student, would likely have had to memorize these words en masse, and not only remember what they meant, but how they functioned grammatically. The texts of both of these works are available online. I would love to be able to recommend to you a real book to actually get and read, but to my knowledge, there is no edition of either work in an affordable and/or accessible translation. If you want to learn Latin, I would recommend mimicking this stage by reading the first couple chapters of the textbook Lingua Latina per se Illustrata. It teaches you the Latin alphabet and basic grammar in Latin that's easy enough to understand for someone who doesn't know any Latin. I can't recommend this textbook enough. It's how I learned Latin. It's how most of the best Latinists I know learned Latin. And by reading and rereading the first couple chapters of that book, I think you really would be imitating well the first lessons of Bede's childhood. After learning the alphabet and basic grammar, monks were ready to start copying texts in the scriptorium, which was one of their most important and most frequent tasks. We know that they started this early in their career, mainly because of the amount of mistakes that some scribes make, which unfortunately betray that they actually really don't know the Latin language that well. Bede recognized this problem early on, so he composed for his students what's called an orthography, a reference book for words that often pose challenges to beginners. For example, Bede warns us that the word formosus is not spelled with an N. This was a common spelling mistake dating even back to the classical era, and Bede must have noticed his students getting confused at all the different variants and repeating the same mistake, so he told them not to. In another example, he says that when you ausculto, when you listen, you're listening to someone, so the name of the person you're listening to has to be in the dative case, not the accusative. This must have also been a mistake that Bede frequently noticed his students making. We can imagine that the orthography was probably another early learning tool that Bede either narrated to his students or supplied for reference while they were copying. Number 2. Beginner texts. A student who had learned the basics of the Latin language was ready for actual texts, which would likely be read to them in lecture-style lessons. The beginner texts used were usually either prayers or selections from the Psalms, or moral texts that the students would hear over and over again, learning them backward and forward, until they had, hopefully, really acquired a feel for the Latin language in use and learned the moral lessons included in the texts themselves. For Bede, nothing came before the Lord's Prayer and the Nicene Creed. It was his belief, expressed explicitly in a letter to one of his pupils, that even if someone knew basically nothing about anything, as long as they knew what the text of the Our Father and the Creed meant, they could still live an effective spiritual life. Which, of course, to Bede, was the most important aspect of education. Besides these two prayers, monks also had to chant from the Psalms several times a day, and knowing what they were actually singing would have been another high priority for early education. What good is chanting random noises that make no sense to you? In order to really meditate on the Psalms, you have to understand them, and since you're singing them in Latin, you have to learn the Latin. For monks then and now, the Psalms were beautifully inviting artistic texts, and studying them never got old. What's more, in the Vulgate they aren't composed into any sort of meter, and Jerome's Latin is pretty straightforward and simple. These factors combine to make the Psalms the perfect beginner text for young students. If you want to read the Psalms in the exact same Latin that the monks were reading, I would recommend the Dumbarton Oak's Poetical books, which has the Psalms, the Book of Job, Proverbs, Wisdom, Ecclesiastes, all books that the monks were very interested in and read frequently. The nice thing about the facing page translation is that if the Latin confuses you at any point, you can just look over at the English and have it explained to you, as if Bede himself were sitting over your shoulder while you read. We know from the book lists of contemporary school teachers that there were a few other Latin texts considered apt for beginners by the early medieval English. One of the most famous of these is called the Distichs of Cato, which is a pseudepigraphical, meaning it wasn't actually composed by Cato, set of maxims in relatively simple poetic Latin. Things like don't talk too much and don't let praise go to your head are told in bite-sized two-line poems that would have been relatively easy to memorize and probably recited on command by Bede's students. Two other texts we know were taught in the classroom early were the Satires, the Satires, of Juvenal and Persius. Like the Distichs of Cato, they are poems extremely interested in moral uprightness and the customs of the times, but unlike the Distichs of Cato, they were real Roman texts talking about imperial Roman society and covered in mythological references and allusions. They probably represent the first pagan texts that students were allowed to read, specifically chosen for their hard stances on things like laziness, greed, licentiousness, and other forms of social decay that strict conservatives like Bede would have felt were still prevalent in his England. The satires of both Juvenal and Persius are dense and difficult texts, and learning them would have been an arduous task for a beginner. We often find medieval commentaries and glossaries on difficult texts like these, so it's likely that Bede would have had one of them on hand while teaching. Or perhaps these students, being a bit older, would be allowed to consult reference texts like this in the library of their own volition. If you want to read the Satires, there's a great Loeb edition that contains both Persius and Juvenal in the same book, and for Juvenal specifically, Cambridge has published a commentary on his first book. I will warn you that even experienced Latinists today struggle with these texts. It's mind-blowing to me that they were included in the early curricula of English monks. Never let anyone convince you that people in the Middle Ages were just unintelligent. Number 3. Advanced Latin. So now you've learned Latin grammar, and you've learned some essential texts for getting a feel for the language. During this time, the more advanced you got, the more you'd be receiving your religious education in Latin. In daily lessons and readings, you'd learn the entirety of the Bible, of course in Jerome's Latin Vulgate translation. You'd be treated to homilies and sermons and lessons by and on the writings of several church fathers, but most especially Jerome, Augustine, Gregory, and Ambrose. Bede's more advanced students would get lessons on things like the calculation of time and the ages of the world, and in doing so they would have to learn texts like Augustine's City of God, the Jewish historian Josephus, the Romans Pliny the Elder and Lucretius, the church historians Orosius and Eusebius, and many other authors. For the improvement of your Latin in particular, we know that Bede had a few copies of Cicero's orations, namely his second speech against Verres and his fourth speech against Catiline. These texts would have been studied as examples of good Latin and good argumentation, as they still are today. Cicero's orations are read not only by modern students of Latin, but also students of law, declamation, politics, as some of the best examples of argumentation and rhetoric in human history. Bede appreciated them, but preferred to draw from Christian exemplars, and really considered Augustine to be one of the greatest masters of the Latin language. Consequentially, lessons on the City of God and the Confessions would have drawn attention to not only what the saint was saying, but how he said it, focusing on his style and elocution. There were many classical Greek and Roman treatises on rhetoric that Bede had access to, but he was unhappy with how much they touted pagan authors and pagan poets as the masters of the language. In Bede's mind, the saints and biblical figures involved in constructing sacred scripture were not only much more impressive, but also older, and therefore deserving of the highest position in discussions of artistic ingenuity. Virgil and Homer are great, but Bede preferred David and Solomon, and in order to educate his students on the merits of biblical rhetoric, he composed two short works named De Schematibus and De Tropis, which basically mean on forms and on figures, that is, of speech. These are really fascinating texts. He explains things like anaphora and polysyndeton, and gives biblical examples for all of them. He says that a metaphor is like when David says that the Lord has rescued him from the paw of the lion. An allegory is like when Christ said that the fields were ready to be harvested in John 4:35. My favorite is his explanation of irony. He gives the example of when Elijah taunted the priests of Baal, saying, "You should shout louder, maybe Baal is asleep." The benefit to raising students on a text like this is twofold. Not only do you want them to become competent Latinists who can identify rhetorical tools in use, you also want to prevent them from falling so in love with pagan Latin texts that they slip in their own faith. Reading Virgil is okay, as long as you remember that Elijah was cleverer. You can appreciate Lucan as long as you know that David was a better artist. You can be moved by Ovid's Metamorphoses, but you should be more moved by the Word of God. That's what Bede thought, at least. Speaking of these poets, they seem to have been Bede's guilty pleasure. He quotes Statius 7 times, Ovid 16 times, Lucan 18 times, and good old Virgil shows up 128 times in Bede's works. These were the big four: Statius, Ovid, Lucan, and Virgil, pagan Roman poets who enjoyed immense popularity and attention from the monastics of medieval England. It's no coincidence that Bede seems to know them just as well as Chaucer, who 700 years later names those four poets specifically, alongside Homer, as the great names that he wants to emulate at the end of Troilus and Cressida. These poets, however, being pagan, would not have been available to Bede's younger students, and the reason I'm confident in this is because in his educational works, Bede bends over backwards in order to shoehorn the Christian Latin poets, like Prosper of Aquitaine and Venantius Fortunatus, in the place of the usual classical exemplars. Not only that, but we have several quotes of Bede dismissing non-Christian literature, and at one point he even explicitly said that he chose not to read Porphyry of Tyre because it was pagan poetry. If this were all we had from Bede, we would be led to the conclusion that he genuinely disliked Virgil and Ovid and shunned them except under absolute necessity. That is probably at least the impression that he wanted his younger students to have. But he betrays himself when he writes his own poetry. He just can't help trying to make good art and borrowing lines from the Romans. When we take a step back and compare the frequency with which Bede cited Virgil to, say, Caelius Sigillius, the most cited Christian Latin poet in Bede's corpus, there's still no comparison. Virgil blows him out of the water. And to make the divide even more explicit, almost all of the Sigillius references are in educational texts. You can count on your fingers the amount of times Bede actually tried to emulate Sigillius. Virgil, on the other hand, is all over Bede's poetry and was clearly his primary poetic influence. I don't want to act like Bede was secretly sneaking off to his room to read the Georgics, though. He did openly admit to reading pagan poetry and said that it had its benefits. He compared it to Moses learning the wisdom of the Egyptians, or St. Paul quoting from Greek poetry. It's just a little suspicious how well Bede knew Virgil. 128 citations across your life's work for an early medieval author didn't just mean that you sometimes had the book on hand. It meant that you probably had large swaths of the text memorized, if not the entire thing, and you don't just do that for fun. Well, no, what I mean is that in a monastery you actually probably would only do that for fun. I think Bede really loved these poems. To bring us back on track, this probably constitutes the final stepping stone in your monastic Latin learning journey. Now that you're older and a bit more responsible and your Latin is more comfortable, you'd be allowed to, and perhaps sometimes even encouraged, to read Statius's Thebaid, Lucan's Pharsalia, Ovid's Metamorphoses, as well as Virgil's Eclogues, Georgics, and of course the Aeneid. Bede also seems to have read Ovid's Ars Amatoria, the amatory art, which is an absolutely scandalous text on lovemaking. But given the subject material, this was probably reserved for only the most trusted and mature students. These are the hallmarks of classical Latin poetry, and some of the most studied texts in human history, so you don't need me to encourage you to go read them. Just in case, I'll have links in the description to the books that I recommend, and commentaries where they exist. My strategy when reading classical Latin texts that I've never read before is typically to have the Loeb on the left hand, and then the Cambridge commentary on the right hand open to the comments, and with the page covering the Loeb translation. I'll look at the Latin first. If the Latin doesn't make sense, I'll read the comments. If the comments don't help, I'll read the translation, and then I'll go back and reread the Latin until I understand it. Bede learned these texts without the help of a translation, but he also had a lot more time than I do, so I give myself a little leeway there. I've also read way more second language acquisition theory than him, so take that, Bede. I hope you've enjoyed this video on Bede's Latin education. It's a subject that really fascinates me, and I'm looking to make more Bede content in the future. As always, do let me know if there's anything in particular you'd like to see me cover relating to early medieval England. If you like this kind of content, check out the rest of the channel, kindly consider subscribing or becoming a supporter on Patreon, and until next time, Farathye Yesunde.